Hi, everybody. Welcome to my talk, It's All Fun and Games Until Someone Deploys on a Friday. You might know me. My name is Joshua Lewis. I'm currently the Chief Technology Officer at a company called For Good. And as you might have heard earlier, I'm also an interview engineer for Carrot. I know the schedule today is quite packed, so thank you for choosing to listen to me. I'm honored and privileged for the opportunity. Just in case you weren't aware, ordinarily at a live conference, you feel a bit bad. You go to a talk, you don't enjoy it, you kind of leave the room to go to another talk. So it's a little bit easier, with the live conference to skip and chop and change between talks. Just want to let you know that the producers from Ant give us a live count of attendees in each room. So even though you won't need to get up and leave, I'll still know that you've left. No, I'm just kidding. Let's get started. So to start off with, I'd like to run a quick poll, and I'll do this via Twitter and via Slack. The tweet's already up, and it's already up on Slack as well. Imagine it's Friday afternoon at work, and someone suggests deploying the latest release of your software to your live environment. Do you A, break out in a cold sweat and kiss your weekend plans goodbye? Or B, continue sipping on your beverage of choice, deploy, and go home at an appropriate time and enjoy your weekend? Before you vote on Twitter or Slack, take a second or two to think about why you're choosing that specific choice. And we'll have a look towards the end of the talk what the votes are, and I think it'll be an interesting discussion. I mentioned that I work at For Good. We provide a web-based marketplace for people to find giving opportunities. If you go to forgood.co.za, you'll find many incredible opportunities to give back to NGOs and similar causes. A quick note about the times in which we find ourselves with the lockdown due to coronavirus. What many people don't realize is you don't need to leave your house in order to give back. A lot of the causes on the platform are looking for services that you can provide from home during the lockdown and afterwards. So go have a look at the website, and there's especially a campaign that we've got up, volunteering in the time of coronavirus. Now, one of the advantages of live streaming a talk instead of pre-recording it is you get to take advantage of opportunities like this. Rory, I just want to thank you for the setup and for amping up the excitement about the talk. Now, at For Good, we often deploy on Fridays, and sometimes we even tweet about it, like I did just before 5 o'clock on Friday, the 5th of July last year. And what often happens is these tweets get interesting reactions. So, for example, this one from Johan Meiring. Another South African developer, Cornel Duplessis, replied with this, which was also quite funny. 2 weeks later, on Friday the 19th of July, I tweeted this. Guess who just triggered a deploy from their phone while walking out of the office for the weekend? Now, this one really received some great reactions. First up, from DevConf organizer, my favorite father at Christmas, and all-round incredible human being, Robert McLean. Hopefully, most of you know where this image comes from, but some of our younger audience might not. Next one up, from Philippa Rose Tart, Managing Director of Purple Raindrop. A couple of other interesting ones, always amusing to see the responses. Now, even though my tweets may have been a little provocative, the vigor and force that some of the responses have is quite interesting. Why do so many people have such strong feelings towards the topic? For example, Rudy, beg your pardon, Rory saying, don't deploy on Fridays. Now, I happen to know a lot of the people who've responded to my tweets. And I know that they've all got quite a lot of experience, and that's interesting to me. And they generally know that deploys can turn out badly. They've experienced in the past that their lives and their organizations have been affected negatively with bad deploys. Now, fundamentally, in order to get it to its users, we need to deploy software. And this deployment, this getting the software to the hands of users, represents risk, because software is quite complex and you're changing it, right? So there's a lot of complexity involved. You don't always understand very well the effects that those changes are going to have. So there's risk. Now, managing this risk poorly can have a significant impact on a business, as well as the quality of the professional life of developers. What's more, the fear of this risk also prevents us from realizing a lot of value for ourselves, for our organizations, and for our customers. I've had many bad experiences in the past in my career. I've given up evenings and weekends to do deploys. I've even sat crying at my desk after a terrible deploy cost my employer a significant amount of money. I've learned from my mistakes, and fortunately, I haven't had one of these experiences for quite a long time. And I've worn many hats in my career, including developer, trainer, consultant, agile coach, lecturer, interview engineer, and now chief technology officer. Now, in each of these roles, I've spoken quite a lot about things like continuous delivery and automation and robustness, resilience, those sorts of things. But it's only recently, in the last couple of years, that I've started to feel like I've started to succeed at those things. Okay. At For Good, we manage and mitigate the risks associated with deploying. And we routinely achieve success doing something that many others are too afraid to even try. And from Rory's tweet, from Rory's presentation earlier in the tweet, it seems like even Microsoft might be afraid to try this as well. Even though during lockdown it doesn't feel like there are different days, who knows what day of the week it is now. At For Good, we've actually got strict policies governing when we can deploy and when we can't. The only days on which we're allowed to deploy are those that end in DAY. And the truth is, when you deploy every day of the week, and sometimes even several times a day, Friday becomes just another day. I'd like to tell you a little bit about us as a company, just so you've got a bit more context around some of the things we do. As you can see, we're a small company. We're currently 7 people, and our development team is 2 people, including myself. And the way our platform works is causes upload the things that they need. Then members of the public and our corporate users can then browse, filter, and search through these needs. If the user can provide what the cause is looking for, voila, a nice match is made. Some important things as well to note: we don't handle money transactions or payments ourselves. That gets handled by a third party, and we handle relatively little personal information. So typically email address, phone number, first name and surname. As an organization, we are relatively progressive, and we strive to promote things like flexibility, autonomy, responsibility, and accountability. And what's quite important to us, and something we work quite hard on, is we try to focus on the outcomes of our actions, not so much on the effort we put in or the outputs that we produce, but really, have we moved the needle in a particular goal or area that we want? Our stack is quite small and relatively run-of-the-mill. All our code is hosted on Azure. We use Git and GitHub for version control. Our apps are written in, our server side is written in C#, and client side apps are written in TypeScript and jQuery, and everything runs on .NET on Azure. We're currently using Cosmos DB, which is Microsoft Azure's document database, and we also use PostgreSQL. And as it happens, we're currently in the middle of an effort to move away from Cosmos and back to the boring world of relational data. We use Azure DevOps to take care of our build, test, and deploy automation. And this stack works very well for us. I'd like to take you through some of our the architecture of our apps, and this is a very high-level overview of the things that we have. So we've got 2 websites. One is the sort of user-facing site that's available at forgood.co.za, and that runs the browser client there is written in TypeScript with a framework called Aurelia. Aurelia is quite similar to Angular. Not that much difference between them. That browser client speaks to a server-side API, which is a REST-y type API written in C# with ASP.NET Web API. Then there's some C# code that does things like access to data and the business rules and the domain logic and that sort of thing. As I mentioned, we use PostgreSQL and Cosmos for data storage. And we use a couple of third-party services, Payfast and Mandrill and MailChimp and those sorts of things. We also have an admin website, and that's used mainly by ourselves and also by some of the users at our clients who administer the programs at our clients. And that's mainly server-side rendered. It uses MVC, and there's a little bit of JavaScript that runs in the browser, mainly based on jQuery. And it also reuses a lot of the domain logic and business rules code that I mentioned earlier. Okay. I'd like to take you through some of the ways in which we use Git. Also, relatively uncomplicated, and we try to keep it as simple as possible. We have a master branch that basically holds the code that's in production. We have a develop branch which we use for day-to-day commits. Now and then, and basically whenever we want to deploy code, what we do is we open a pull request on GitHub to move code from the develop branch to the master branch. And when that pull request gets merged, that automatically triggers our build and deploy process. And also when we push code from our local machines to the develop branch on Origin on GitHub, that triggers a development build, and that runs all of our checks. It compiles the browser clients and all those sorts of things. And now and then, when necessary, we create feature branches, and that's for potentially disruptive work that might take a little bit longer than a day or two, but we try not to do that too often. And we also now and then create hotfix branches off our master branch, but we also try and do that as infrequently as possible. And we generally maybe go for a couple of months between hotfix branches. I'd like to take you through our testing approach and our testing philosophy. So I mentioned earlier that one of our websites has an API. Both sites obviously use HTTP to communicate. Both sites also use JSON over the HTTP. And the way we do our testing is our test code consumes the production code the same way that the browser client would. So for our main website, it will communicate directly with the API over HTTP. And the way we do that is we use some of the built-in test server facilities in .NET. So we basically spin up a test server which exposes the HTTP ports, and we communicate with the API in that way. So it's very close to a kind of real-world scenario. The only difference is there isn't really any over-the-wire communication. The server code is exercised when it's consumed. We're actually running it with instances of Postgres and Cosmos. We obviously don't use the production or live instance, but we do have instances running on the machines that on our build server machines and obviously on our local development machines as well. On the admin website, it's a very similar story. The only difference is there's no API. So beg your pardon, there's no HTTP or JSON API. So what we do is we call controller methods directly. In the code, we'll instantiate the controller and call that controller directly. Our philosophy is trying to get to end-to-end testing as far as possible. And the reason why we do that is we want the behavior of our code when we're testing it to be as close as possible to the behavior of the code that's in production. We want to be as confident as possible that we're getting a realistic picture of our code under test as we can. And typically the only things we mark out are possibly blob storage or interaction with third-party APIs like Payfast or MailChimp and that sort of thing. And we try and simulate or mock things as little as possible. Okay. Now, I mentioned earlier that when we push to the develop origin on GitHub, what happens is that triggers a build, a development build. Currently in our development build, we're running just under 450 tests. And as I mentioned to you before, every single one of those tests uses a live instance of the database. The test code interacts with the production code via the API. Each test seeds its own data, and the way it seeds data is it interacts with the API. So when we're expecting, when a test needs a certain data, we actually get that data into the database by calling the API. We don't access the database directly or anything like that. And out of interest, our build currently takes just over 20 minutes. So you can see in this particular case, the tests ran, it doesn't say, the beg your pardon, but our builds currently run just over 20 minutes, and that's including the 50 tests that we run that are end to end. So we've got a lot of confidence in the way that our tests run, and we've managed to get it right that they run quickly enough that we don't do things like we don't hold back from pushing changes because we want to batch them up because that build takes too long and it takes too long to get feedback. We're lucky that it takes us only about 20 minutes to get feedback, so we feel very free to commit often and push often without any problems. Okay, let's look a little bit at our workflow management and those sorts of practices. So this is a picture of the task wall that we have at work. It's probably a little bit out of date now. We haven't been into the office since around about the 17th of March. We've been working from home since then. But it gives a pretty good indication of a typical scenario. It's a typical task board. We've got to do, up next, doing, ready to deploy, and done. Those are some of the columns you can't see in the picture, unfortunately. I couldn't get a better one because we haven't been in the office. And what we try and do is we try and have this as a so-called information radiator. So you'll see there's quite a lot of information being put out. There's post-its of different colors. Those mean different things. There's some post-its with colored dots on them, and each thing like that has a certain significance. So we get quite a lot of information just by looking at that board. And we all in the office, we all sit in the same room. We sit in one room. We chat to each other all the time. It's sort of like a mini open plan. Fortunately, it's not too noisy. Most of the noise is when I'm telling programmer dad jokes, and then most of the time there's dead silence after that. Sometimes there's a bit of a laugh, but it's quite a nice environment and not your typical sort of open plan office. But as I mentioned earlier, a lot of information that's very easily gained from this task wall. What's a little bit harder to see over here is we try and break up the pieces of work that we do into as small as possible pieces, right? So we try and, instead of having larger pieces of work which take a long time, we try and make that as small as possible, that take sort of between an hour to a couple of hours. That's kind of our sweet spots. And I'll talk through some of the reasons why that is a little bit later. Another thing to notice from the photograph, if you look in the doing column, there's currently only 2 pieces of work sitting there. You'll note if you look at the bottom of the photo, you'll see 2 avatars. There's Darkwing Duck. Darkwing Duck is my colleague Rudy. Hey Rudy. And the clown is my avatar. It might be strange, but I actually chose the clown avatar. It's sort of like an ironic thing because I'm not really a funny guy. So I thought I'll kind of step out of my shell a bit and be a clown for a change. So you'll notice in this instance, there's only 2 pieces of work being worked on. Not sure what I was busy doing on that particular day. I'm not working on any development work at that when that photo was taken. But we kind of try and limit the number of balls in the air to as few as possible. Very unlikely that there's as many as 4. There's usually around 2 or 3, sometimes even 1. And again, the reasons for limiting, we'll discuss the reasons for limiting work in progress a little bit later. We're quite big on visibility and transparency, and having a big visible information radiator like this really helps us to be as visible so that everybody knows as far as possible what's going on, everybody's aware of what's going on, everybody's aware of the context, and really helps with transparency. Okay. What's also really nice about this board is it helps us to prioritize very easily and very collaboratively. So we'll have a company stand up at least once a week, and during that stand up, we'll talk about the things that have gone that have been deployed since in the last week. We'll look at what we're currently busy with. We'll look at maybe what's ready to deploy, and we'll have a look at the kind of the end of what's up next. And this gives everybody a good opportunity to discuss, do we have the correct priorities? Do we have the correct sequence? Are we working on the correct things in the correct order? So this kind of prioritization, which is very collaborative, we all stand in front of the board together and we look at the post-its. It's easy to move around. And what's quite funny is after we've moved them around, our CEO, Andy Hadfield, goes and fixes up all the lines, which is quite amusing for me because I don't really care about that kind of orderliness. So that's quite funny to watch. So it takes place at least once a week, but we have the ability, we could prioritize every day or even every couple of hours if we really wanted to. We've got quite a lightweight way of doing this prioritization. And that's where the small work pieces and the limiting work in progress aids as well. If we had much larger pieces of work, it becomes very difficult to shift focus quite quickly. And also, the more pieces of work we're currently dealing with at a particular point in time, the harder it is to bring something new in. Especially with what's hard with writing software, because you kind of made changes and now you want to bring something else in. What do you do with those changes? And also from a cognitive load and multitasking, context switching point of view, the smaller the piece of work is, the easier it is to kind of finish the piece of work before moving on to something else. We also do a lot of swarming and that sort of thing. So, for example, when we have a critical bug, we pretty much drop everything to deal with that. We'll pull in other parts of the company if we need to, so people from the community team or from the client team, and we'll all work together until that bug is solved. So, for example, one of the goals in which the development team is measured is how long it takes us to solve critical bugs. Our SLA with clients is sort of severity 1 errors or really critical bugs are solved within 8 hours or less. Over the past couple of months, our average time to solve critical bugs is around 3 hours or so. And that's something that we work quite hard to keep down and something that we're quite proud of. Okay. We're also really lucky to have really engaged and driven colleagues. So they help us a lot with testing. We've got some really good testers in the team, in the company, even though their job isn't tester, they're really good at testing, really analytical, really systemic, and have a good understanding of kind of where to look for things that may have been changed or things that may have been broken. And also things like writing good bug reports really help us as developers in terms of diagnosing and being able to fix issues. So we're quite lucky there as well. Something that's really important to us is prioritizing safety. Now, we know that mistakes will always happen. We also know that it's gaps in the systems or in our systems, whatever systems those might be, that allow these mistakes to not to occur, but to have an impact, right? When things don't go as planned, even though it might be due to human error, we know that the systems that we have should not allow those human errors to impact anything. So when things don't go as planned, we don't place blame on individuals. We figure out collaboratively how to fix it and then how to plug the gaps in our system so that it doesn't happen again. And this is a really important practice for things like removing a lot of the fear around deploying. Right? We also make sure that we have good feedback loops in place so when things don't go as planned, we can respond as quickly as possible. And all these things, our tool sets, our workflow management, our people-oriented practice, they kind of collectively come together to enable us to effectively manage risk, to manage the risk of deploying. And in turn, the ability to deploy confidently, frequently, and safely unlocks a lot of value for us, for the business, and for our customers. Okay. it allows us to shift focus rapidly and safely when something in our context changes, right? And that change in context could be a showstopper or critical bug that's occurred. It could be a change in our hosting infrastructure. So, for example, we used to host in Western Europe Azure data centers. When Microsoft opened their Azure data centers in South Africa, that's a change in our context. We wanted to respond to that as quickly as possible because it had advantages for us as a business and for our customers. Rory, I'm guessing that the opening of the data centers in South Africa didn't happen on a Friday, though. But most importantly, the kind of change in context that we're talking about could be a new business opportunity. Something that's not on our radar pops up very quickly, and we want to be able to move quickly enough to take advantage of that opportunity as quickly as possible. It's important to bear in mind that this ability to shift focus rapidly is not only a technical capability, it's also a product capability, and it's important across the entire company. However, the technology aspects are critical because they enable the rest of the business. Okay, I just want to point out that we do make plans, we do a lot of planning, but we're also happy to change that plan together when we think it's the right thing to do. And coming back to this idea of shifting focus rapidly and safely, Craig Larman, who among many other things developed large-scale Scrum, has a really nice way of phrasing it. He calls it to turn on a dime for a dime. So changing focus very quickly should be as frictionless and as cheap and quick as possible, that we can pursue any opportunity that comes our way. Okay. Now, being able to deploy quickly whenever we want and being able to deploy safely is an important marker, is an important feedback signal that we are able to shift our focus quickly. And we're now in a position where we can manage the risk of deploying well enough that it enables us as a business to respond almost immediately to any kind of change, right? If we find a critical bug on a Friday afternoon, we'll fix it and deploy, no problem. If a client calls us on a Friday afternoon asking for something to change, no problem, we'll do it and deploy. And not only is this capability a nice to have, it's a competitive advantage. It allows us to move with enough speed that we can outcompete the competitors that we have in our markets. Okay, so if this sounds appealing to you and you're thinking that this is something you're interested in looking at, I have a few ideas for some steps you can take. The first step is analyzing, having a look at your 3 most recent deploys, analyzing them, maybe do a kind of retrospective, that sort of thing, and start thinking about, well, the next time we deploy, how can we make that better? Choose one, maybe 2 things that you think will be able to help you to make that deploy smoother or less risky, those sorts of things. And if you do this over time, each deploy you change one small thing, over time that adds up quite quickly. The next step that you might think of doing is figuring out if fear is holding you back. So something you might want to do is have an open and honest discussion within your team, within your department, within your organization about whether and how your fear of risk might be holding you back as an organization. And this is something that I've seen quite a lot is we have a lot of kind of legacy fears of things that have happened in the past. And as a result, we've kind of built in control and governance, which was appropriate at the time, but it might not be appropriate anymore. So is that fear of risk holding you back from achieving things as an organization that you would want to achieve? Okay. The last kind of step that you might want to consider is looking at some kind of de-risking. So you could brainstorm with your team and stakeholders, what are those risks? And what risks do you think there are that you can experience? How can you manage some of those risks? But also importantly, when you're talking about how can we manage those risks, how can we prevent them from happening? How can we lessen the impact of that hazard if it does happen? What's important is 2 things. One, how much effort and time and money are you willing to invest into making those risks manageable? There has to be a return on that investment, right? There has to be some benefit to that effort, and that equation needs to make sense. You also need to be really needs to be really important that you make that you build safety into those experiments, right? Pretty easy to throw caution to the wind and start trying things to mitigate risks without safety, and if that happens, it's not really a good idea, right? You need to de-risk with safety in mind. It needs to be built in. Now we know that during lockdown, unfortunately, we can't get Uber Eats, but fortunately, I do have some takeaways for you. De-risk deploys are competitive advantage, right? I mentioned this earlier. We started off by talking about how deploys are risky. But if we can tame that risk, our organizations can respond to change quickly and safely, right? This can become a competitive advantage. You can respond faster than your competitors do. You can outcompete them in the markets. Friday deploys are not an all or nothing thing. There's a spectrum, right? On the one hand, you've kind of got what you might be doing now. And on the other hand is, well, we can deploy every 10 minutes if we wanted to, or we can deploy every Friday, or we can, as a lot of companies do, well, we just have automated deployments kicking off every hour and whatever's ready to go goes, right? There's no manual intervention. But what's important to realize is there's a lot of middle ground between those two extremes. And it's important for you to figure out where in that spectrum is appropriate for you as a company, and to iterate to that level, and also to be aware of when that point might change as well. And the last kind of takeaway I want to leave you with is deployment performance. So this, how you do in deploys, how risky they are? Do you have any bugs that kind of crop up frequently after deploys? That kind of performance is a really good indicator. It's really good feedback about how your organization perceives and deals with risk, right? So you might talk the talk. You might say, "Oh, we think about risk in this way," but that might not be the reality on the ground. And looking at your deployment is a really good way of gauging kind of how you're managing that risk. Once again, I want to thank you for the opportunity of talking to you today. I really hope you enjoyed it. Thank you again for listening, and thank you to Robert and Candice and everybody else involved in the sponsors. I've really enjoyed the conference today, and let's. I don't know if there are any questions. I haven't seen anything on Zoom yet. But please, if you have any questions, I'd love to discuss it. Rory, I'd especially like to hear your thoughts on the topic, and I'm around on the Slack as well for the rest of the day. The Twitter link from Suzanne, I'm not sure which Twitter link that she's referring to, but what I will do is, if you look at my Twitter handle is at Josh I. Lewis, so just cycling back there quickly. And you'll probably find what the Twitter link for the, if you look on my profile, you should find the poll over there, beg your pardon. Okay, any other questions? Cool. So I see there's no other questions that have come through Zoom, so I'm going to quickly pop onto the Slack. There we go. Let's see. Okay, I'm just catching up. Cool. So like, there's a comment here. If it's hard to do it more often, that's cool. Stefan's comment about Friday deploys being about peace of mind is great. Don't see any questions yet. Rory asks, how do you handle large repos? So I think we're getting to a stage from a technology point of view, and things, companies like Facebook and Amazon and Google, whatever our opinions of them, have certainly been pioneers in the field of handling things at a much larger scale than what we've seen before. And there are a lot of techniques. I personally don't have a lot of experience with many of them, but it is possible, right? And the idea I'm trying to get at isn't necessarily to deploy an Azure data center every Friday, right? It's figuring out what is our risk appetite. What are we comfortable with? What are the things we're willing to accept as an organization and as developers, and what are we not willing to accept? So one of the things that I've had a problem with in the past is developers arriving at work at 10 p.m. to do a deploy, and then spending a couple of hours deploying and then going home and kind of coming back. Now, in certain instances, that can't necessarily be avoided, but it doesn't mean we can't alleviate it. Doesn't mean we can't sort of improve. So for me, it's really a question of how can we figure out what those limits are? How can we figure out what our risk appetite is? And how can we iterate towards a place where we're balancing responsiveness to change with that risk profile, with that perception of risk? Rory, I hope that answers that question. Graham Down says he voted 2 because you can do whatever you want, but don't come crying to me if stuff goes wrong. I have some interesting thoughts about that. If we're developers on a particular code base or on a product, I believe we're all responsible for everything in that code base, everything that goes into production. We have accepted responsibility merely by working on that code base. And you're welcome to disagree with me. But I also see it as our responsibility, especially as we become more senior in an organization, more experienced in senior developers, that it's not a case of, well, you did that, you're responsible for it. I believe that there's a lot of that can drive a lot of behavior that we don't want, right? We have a responsibility towards each other to educate. We have a responsibility towards the organization to protect the organization from that. We have a responsibility to create systems within the organization that don't allow those kinds of things to happen. Mike, Stefan, I don't quite understand your question about our current bottleneck. Bottleneck in what would be my first response. Other comments, looking through Slack. So Gordon mentions in Slack about feature flags. That's also a great way of de-risking things. So if, one thing I didn't mention in the presentation is the difference between releases and deploys. So deploys is physically moving the code or the representation of the code from one environment to another. So from a development environment to from a development environment to an environment that's accessible by users, and that's a deploy. A release is something different. A release is making that functionality available to your users. And an example I really like to use is WhatsApp, right? Facebook's really great at doing these sorts of things. When WhatsApp releases features, the software will be on your phone for months, right? You just don't know about it because you can't see it, but it's there. And it's being tested all the time, right? And they're testing, well, how does it affect the device? Is it crashing on the device? How is it affecting our servers? And those kinds of things. And when they're ready, when they're confident, when they're sure that there's very little risk, they'll turn that feature on, right? And they can turn it on without you even knowing. It could be something like a push message potentially, or a flag on the server API that gets changed. And all of a sudden, consumers can use that functionality. Yeah. Don't see any other questions on Slack, and nothing on Zoom yet either. Cool. So unless you want to just sit and look at my face, which I don't mind either, send some questions. I don't know if Rory's still watching or listening, but it could be a good time for that robust debate. Bottlenecks, team flow of work. A bottleneck in our team's flow of work at the moment. So there are a couple. So the one is the test, the amount of time it takes to run the full suite of tests. That's currently about 20 minutes. Another bottleneck that we have a lot of the time while developing is things like getting most recent data. So we want to check a bug or a feature or whatever kind of work we're doing. We need the latest copy of the data. That currently also takes about 20 minutes. So that's also a bit of a bottleneck for us on a kind of development point of view. Traditional bottlenecks like planning changes or sequence changes or waiting for answers from other people in the company. We're pretty good with that. We all sit in the same room up until lockdown. We've been remote for about 2 weeks now. We use Slack extensively. We do a lot of video calls as well. So communication is not really a bottleneck. So from a development point of view, that's pretty much what I can think of off the top of my head. The time taken to get data will hopefully be decreased very soon. It takes us about 20 minutes to get the documents from Cosmos. We'll hopefully be off Cosmos in a couple of days or weeks, and getting data from Postgres I think takes about 5 minutes. Yeah, and that's pretty much what I can think of in terms of bottlenecks. I see a lot of feedback on Slack. Thank you very much for the feedback. It's really appreciated. I'm sitting at home. Obviously, don't know how many of my programmer dad jokes landed, but I hope a few. So thank you for the feedback. It's really appreciated. Rory, I'm not picking on you. I just think it's funny. How do I encourage DevOps on Fridays? Well, so you mentioned deploying on Fridays doesn't work because Fridays is bra days or beach days or bar days, depending on the city in which you live. Well, if you're lucky enough, you can do all three, right? You can do your DevOps from your phone. As mentioned earlier, I've merged pull requests from my phone as well. And again, if you've de-risked it, if you're confident, if you're iterated to that point, doesn't really matter, right? So you can do it from the bra. Just ideally, it's before too many beers or brandy and cokes. Somebody asked in Slack if the beer emoji means rather go drink beer or hold my beer. That's an interesting question. I think it could be both. Could be both. Yeah. Poll results. Okay, so on Slack, we have 9 votes for kissing your weekend plans goodbye, and we have 8 votes for continue sipping your beverage of choice and leaving at an appropriate time and enjoying your weekend. On Twitter, the results are, let me find it. Let me find that for you. The results on Twitter are out of 55 votes, 36% voted in favor of screaming and kissing your weekend plans goodbye, and 64% approximately voted for continue sipping on your beverage. I'm going to paste that into Slack quickly. Yeah, Gordon's done it for me. Great stuff. So that's quite surprising for me, because when I've tweeted in the past about deploying on Fridays, the majority of feedback is around, how can you do that? whereas a lot of the results here would indicate otherwise. It seems the Slack poll, because it's a free version, we kind of ran out of votes. So that might skew the result. Slightly. I'll blame Robert for limiting our votes. Cool. Another interesting anecdote, which I didn't have in the presentation. JB Rainsberger, who's speaking next, he's the keynote speaker. Also has some interesting views on deploying on Fridays, and his view is, well, we've got checks, we're confident, let's go for it. Gordon, having the beer, is happy to deploy. If you need beer or whiskey or wine in order to deploy, then we should chat. Okay, I think the buzz on Slack is also dying down. Okay. Just scrolling back through Slack to see if there's any other questions that I missed. Interesting point from earlier in the Slack conversation from Gordon. Generally, I've seen whole Fridays be wasted because feature teams rush a Thursday afternoon deploy instead of a safe Friday deploy. That's an interesting behavior, not something I've witnessed personally, but that's a really, really insightful observation and a really great example of driving the wrong behavior. So we think we're doing something well, think we're doing something good, but it ends up biting ourselves later on. Cool. I think that's pretty much it. I don't see anything else in Slack. Nothing else via Zoom so far. Cool. Once again, thank you very much for your attention and for your time. Thank you again to Robert and Candice. You've done an incredible job. Thank you again to all the sponsors for making it possible. And thanks again to you all for listening. Look forward to more chats on Slack, on Twitter, and hopefully soon over a beer or a cold drink.